Hello, my name is Mark Wireman, Senior Manager at Accenture, and I'm going to talk today about security and compliance and how they're one and the same within DevSecOps. So many of you should be familiar, hopefully, with this symbol by this point in time in your career. And it's quite a familiar symbol for many of us, especially those of us that have been in the IT industry, that includes development, operations, security, and all things that are encompassing IT, where this infinity symbol or system of DevSecOps is quite familiar. Where it starts to get a little bit fuzzy, and many of you have probably experienced this, is when it gets fuzzy and starts to lose a little bit of familiarity, is when it make its way outside of to the other parts of the organization. And what I'm talking about specifically is when you get into the C-suite. The vision and view and perception of DevOps is a little different. When we talk about audit and compliance, we talk about business, talk about risk management, risk mitigation, et cetera. Those parts of the business tend to see this as a little bit of a fuzzy area that they don't quite understand or have a concept or grasp around. And that's because too many of those those other parts of the organization really see DevOps equating to Agile. So whenever you say DevOps, the first thing they typically say, at least in my experience, is Agile. We all kind of cringe when we hear that, right? Because that's really a misconception, where Agile is a way to push changes and new products faster with processes and methodologies without all of that other stuff that tends to get in the way, again, from their perception that Agile makes things faster, leaner, go into production without all of the other what are considered roadblocks to be in a way. It says the misconception that DevOps automatically brings security, compliance, audit, and risk management. We also see that as a very common misperception, and it's far too often prevalent in the industry. And quite frankly, it's been quite costly in the industry, with hackers being able to take advantage of sort of this imbalance between the need to move faster without considering security and compliance. We've seen the prevalence of attacks. We've seen the severity of these attacks hit the industry by storm. This is not surprising, right? Given that the evolution of DevOps really has a long, tumultuous history that goes all the way back to the 1950s. How do you ask? Well, simply, since the advent of computing systems, there have been software that's been developed to run on and support these systems. And operations have been there along the way to support and maintain the systems. And what's ironic about that is, in the early days, you actually had Dev and Ops working together. In often cases, they were one and the same, or they would work in collaboration within a room. You'd have a specialty, but they would all come together with the same common goal. So we've gone from 1950s and 60s to where they work together to now they're sort of working in disparate cycles. So as systems become, and over the years since the 1950s, since these systems have become more prevalent in our lives, from finance to health to automotive to the next generation thing, this now has highlighted the need for security, compliance, and other things to really protect this organizations and the customers from compromise. And because of these processes have seen the evolution through the years being brought in as more manual, it gives the appearance that if you simply flip the switch and bring on this new methodology called DevOps, that this automatically is going to transition as part of that journey because it's perceived as being automatically embedded as part of it. Again, that misconception of what this really means. So what DevOps really brings, right, is a new paradigm in how software is developed, in how systems are developed, in how operations work. And now it's in how security has to come along the way as part of a partner between security, compliance, operations, and dev to really help bring that part of the important aspect to your development, testing, and deployment of systems. So what does this DevOps thing really mean? Well, it's a little confusing if you were to look out across the landscape and try and get an understanding of what DevOps really means, right? You have all of these different symbols. You have DevOps, DevSecOps, SecDevOps, DevOpsSec, DevXOps. So the industry has seen this explosion in the overuse in the word and the term of DevSecOps or DevOps. Well, really, and if you boil it down, it's really just bringing Dev plus Sec plus Ops together in a way that we have not seen before, in that supports automation and push out to production faster, leaner, quicker, and more securely. So when we boil it down, when you look at DevOps, well, that really means Dev and Ops coming together as a continuous function. When you look at DevSecOps or SecDevOps or DevOpsSec, it's really saying we're going to come together in a continuous function for Dev plus Sec plus Ops. But then you see this DevXOps. What does that mean? Well, that's just yet another iteration to bring something together. And not only bring something together, we're starting to see this now explode towards ML ops, which means machine learning ops. We see it in AI ops, artificial intelligence ops. We see it in data ops. That's where you're bringing your data assets into operations. But fundamentally, it's still DevSecOps, because no matter what X you put there, you have to secure it. You have to make sure it adheres to compliance. You have to develop a solution around it, and you have to maintain and support it. So far too often, instead of DevOps like shift to automation as a rule and manual as an exception, the one symbol and name that I always like to see, and I've heard this in other parts, in other speech, other podcasts and other presentations, is with DevFollops. This is where many organizations are still bringing in that heavyweight manual waterfall processes for security, compliance, risk, and change management in an attempt to overlay in a DevOps way through the lens of Agile, only to end up with roadblocks, confusion, and still operating like an analog process in a very digital world. Hence the growing number of the various iterations of what we're seeing of Dev plus Sec plus Ops in the industry. So with all this name saturation that's going on, where security fits into DevOps, or maybe it doesn't fit into DevOps, or maybe it fits into there in either the end or maybe in the middle, or maybe at will, let's step back to the days before DevOps and look at the fundamental of what is used to identify risks within the SDLC and operations. So today, every organization typically asks, does the system function without error and without slowing down release to production? However, that is a fundamentally flawed question to ask. Why is that? Because they should be asking the question of not only does it function without error, does it function in a way it's supposed to and operate with acceptable and traceable risk? So when you look at how this process in its fundamental aspect, fundamental core is supposed to work, it's very simple. It's a three-pronged process. So risk assessment, evaluation, identification, risk mitigation. What feeds into the risk assessment? Well, you need your guidelines, you need your policies, you need your frameworks, you need your compliance requirements, compliance and regulatory requirements, because those help in establishing the gaps that need to be identified as you make your way through the process. It also helps to, as you get into your risk assessment, it also helps to identify the what and the how from a review perspective. And I like to use this example. A web application that manages, views, processes health information is not the same application that simply serves PDF files of marketing material. Those are fundamentally different applications. Yet in the DevOps way of life and the way that it's done today, those two applications are treated the same criticality level, which means they undergo the same rigorous process of assessment, which brings and bears frustration to the organization. That's where that risk assessment helps establish the criteria of what do we really need to drive to get to that acceptable and traceable risk that gives us the comfort level of knowing that that application is going out to production in a safe and secure way. Evaluation identification. So taking that risk assessment, the process to identify those gaps, what needs to be identified, and making sure we're running those evaluation identification criteria appropriately. Do I need to do a SAST? Do I need to do a DAST? Do I need to do a pen test? What policies, procedures, compliance requirements do I need to bring in for my configuration of my infrastructure as the infrastructure as code components? What are my coding standards? What kind of training do I need to do? Those are all aspects that come into the evaluation identification. And by the way, these can be done automatically, right? Risk mitigation. Now that I've identified it, identified it, how do I then mitigate it? If I have a high vulnerability, I need to mitigate it in this time period. If I have medium, I need to mitigate it in this time period. If I have critical, I probably want to do it right away. So those help establish those things. Also from a compliance perspective, because we don't think about this when we talk about the rating, but what compliance aspects that are coming out of this that get evaluated and identified, can I go ahead and release now or something that I need to fix? And all of this, so the categories are actually the controls that come in to support this decision-making and how ultimately I want to mitigate these risks. So it's as simple and as hard as what you see here. What are some of the challenges? Well, we've all know people and change management are the number one challenge, right? You're basically telling people how to do their job and they don't like that, right? And you're forcing these people to play in the same sandbox. They don't like to share their Tonka toys, right? They like to play with in their own sandbox with their own version of their Tonka toys. Well, DevOps is saying, no, we got to break that silo down. We got to come together. There's a lot of advantages to doing that. We just got to get better in helping them with that. Development is still going back to the 1960s up until today. Development still feels the pressure to get out into production quick. Business says, I got to get this out there. If I don't, I'm going to lose $5 million. So there's still this huge need to release quickly. There's still also a little bit of a separation. We'll see that in the slide in a little bit of where the separation still exists today. And there's still this challenge to measure the ability to meet project exit criteria. So what is it ultimately that I, as a developer, what's my goalpost so that I can make sure I'm meeting that goalpost, and how can it be effectively measured so I know that I'm attaining that goalpost before I get there? That's a huge challenge in DevOps. Products are doing better. They're still lagging behind and being able to change in supporting this new modern development methodology. Throwing a dashboard out there is not an answer. There's on average, and I can't remember the name of the study, there's a study that was done that for each DevOps iteration within an organization, there's on average 12 different dashboards. That is not going to scale. We've got to get better at consolidating this information. Also, the products themselves haven't scaled in a way that DevOps scales. You still have this enterprise behemoth product that you need to install within your organization that has this massive server, has these other dependent components, it has this license server that has all this other stuff. That's difficult to scale in DevOps. They're getting better, but they're not quite there yet. There's also poor integration, right? They're still siloed. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that, but thou shalt never talk to each other. They've got to start communicating. Again, get back to the ability to measure and provide those goalposts for the developers. Security and compliance, still seen today as a rubber stamp function. We've got to change that. We've got to get security and compliance integrated. Security and compliance has to have a complete mind shift and paradigm shift in the way that they take their analog solutions or analog way of life and morph it over to a digital way of working. We can't have spreadsheets that go down and do a check and take screen shares and verify and validate you have this information. Even reports, if you generate a report, that's great, but you got to be able to put some kind of automation around it that scans that report, provides a feedback to the respective parts of the organization to then make a quick decision on without having to set up a meeting and go through those reports. And then operations, it's a whole new paradigm for operations because a lot of things now are code. Infrastructure is code, cloud assets, everything's virtual. They don't have these big servers with these knobs and switches and cables to plug in anymore. They now have to deal with these virtual assets, and that's a whole different way of thinking. So how do you maintain version of those assets? How do you learn how to write code? How do you learn how to push that code through a development methodology? That's where, again, a lot of this mindset has to start coming together, and that's where all of these groups need to come together to deal with these challenges within DevOps and bring compliance and security as part of that journey. So speaking of that, so how do we transform it? Well, governance really drives the transformation of behavior within DevOps. And I like to use this way of visual to show that you have governance that provides that critical starting point that will then educate and enable the people, which would then you can use to establish those processes to make sure that those people are staying within that respective guardrails. And you can use the technologies then to drive the processes and make it completely seamless for the way that the people do and manage and handle security and compliance within DevOps. Far too often, we see them start with technology. Technology is the worst place to start. Technology will only get you to a worse situation quicker. If you don't know where you're starting, you're just exacerbating the problem when you put technology. Companies will have technologies they paid $5, $6, $7 million for. They're only using 10% of this capability. The rest of it's just sitting on the shelf, becoming dustware. So this is DevSecOps really brings the need to understand your governance, your compliance, your risk, those processes, which can then filter down and make it a very seamless, integrated, embedded solution that developers don't even have to worry about. Operations don't even have to worry about. But again, you have to drive a governance and not technology. So what does this really look like? Well, a busy slide, but you can see that the concepts are digital transformation, being secure and compliant, increase visibility, reduce the cycle time. These are the elements. We want to bring patterns, anti-patterns, security as guardrails, guiding principles, all of these components that help drive that, right? So here's your governance. Here's your elements as part of your governance, which feeds into your process. And then here's your activities, right? So as part of these activities, these things are ongoing, right? From the couple of previous slides back, you want this to be iterative and continuous at each step, depending on the need, right? So this is really ultimately where we want to drive and really help organizations embed compliance and security within their DevOps methodology. Again, it's as easy and as hard as that, right? This here is probably one of my favorite slides because it really lays it out. You see the continuum here. We talk about DevSecOps, SDLC, and continuous security and compliance. So when you talk about DevOps, you're talking about continuous. From continuous security, governance, and compliance, all the way to continuous and build. And when I mentioned earlier, developers are still driving DevOps and they're still leading DevOps, that is because greater than 80% of the organizations, when they say they're doing DevOps, and this is supported by tons of research, greater than 80%, when they say they're doing DevOps, they're really doing continuous build. And then it starts decreasing in percentage as you work your way up. Fewer are doing continuous integration plus continuous build. Fewer are doing continuous delivery plus continuous integration plus continuous build, so on and so forth, all the way up to less than 10%, and I would even argue less than 5%, have any components or aspects of a continuous security and governance compliance. And very few organizations, if any, are doing what I call a pre-plan phase. You'll never see a pre-plan in any literature, because this to me is one of the most important fundamental aspects of making sure you get continuous security, governance, and compliance within your DevOps process, program. This is where you start laying out, from a transformational perspective, the what and the how from a governance standpoint. Once you have that, then you can move into the other parts of your SDLC, your plan, your develop, your build, your test, right? So your pre-plan encompasses the continuous security, governance, and compliance. Your plan falls into operations, deployment, delivery. Develop falls into integration and build. And of course, build, test, release, well, you can follow it throughout, but that's the concept here. One of the other things that are very important, and you don't see this very often, is you have to have a way and a process and a model that captures those vulnerabilities and deals with the mitigation. It's answering that question, now what? It's great you can find issues. It's great pen testers can go out and find a vulnerability and report it, but what are you going to do with it? It's great that a SaaS product can go out and find it. What are you going to do with it? It's great you can go find compliance issues, but what are you going to do with it? So that's where your vulnerability management process comes in. This here, to me, is really all-encompassing in what we should be striving towards with a DevSecOps program, where security and compliance are an embedded part of that, and they're one and the same. When you overlay it from a delivery model perspective, again, keeping with that continuous flow, continuous cycle, continuous mindset, here's where those pillars fall in. And again, you see continuous security and compliance is an integral part of that. And these are some of the representative examples of that. So security and compliance is a journey in DevSecOps. So when you look at the overlay of DevSecOps and you look at it from a journey perspective, this is really what we see typically when organizations go through this transformation. Over on the left, that's where you have a lot of your ad hoc and on-demand capabilities. So you have yearly demands, you have quarterly requirements, and you may have some inconsistencies in the way that some of these things are actually adopted as part of your Agile DevSecOps processes. Then you can move towards automation, right? So as you're shifting and moving further into the automated processes, now you're looking at bringing these things and automating some of these capabilities, right? This is where now you start bringing in that governance aspect, really important, right? So you have your governance, management, and compliance that are brought in as part of this. You have security that's an integral part of this process, right? And then you have your on-demand services. So those are your simulations, those are your policy and compliance requirements, because those things change. So you got to have them on demand. They have to constantly be feeding into your process. And then you move towards faster remediation, right? So then you can start looking at other things like self-healing code, integrated SOC, all of those other components, right? But really fundamentally, you want to get towards this automated continuous security and compliance component as part of that transformation in on-demand services and capabilities to support the integration and embedding of security and compliance as a fundamental function within your DevSecOps journey. How we get there? Well, I say you have to have a COE, right? Some people call it a DevSecOps Center of Excellence model. Some people call it a Center of Enablement model. However you want to phrase it, it's fundamentally you have to get there using the right level of oversight, governance, architecture, and operational execution. And one of the most important aspects of this is you have to have that cross-functional leadership in management, because that is what's going to drive the human capital changes within that organization. If you don't have that cross-functional leadership, you're going to do a bottom-up drive versus a top-down push. And that's going to leave back to what we talked about, that the developers are going to be the ones driving it. And 80% of your DevOps transformation is going to be considered within that CI realm, and you're still going to do the rest of it either ad hoc or manual. So it's really important to get this. So the culture and learning and the measurement as well. So being able to provide that feedback up and down the stack so that you can give that full level transparency and perspective around what's happening as I'm transforming, and including compliance and security in that journey, right? That's where your guardrails and technologies come in. It's where your policies and processes come in. Now, what does it look like from an Agile perspective? Because we can't talk about DevOps without talking about Agile. I know I kind of beat up a little bit on Agile earlier, but Agile really drives and provides that project management oversight capability, provides the processes and the methodology, right? Where DevOps is the execution from an automation perspective. So when you lay it out from an Agile perspective, here's where all these activities fit in, right? From planning all the way to maintenance, gate checks, et cetera. But you can see it's still an iterative part of this process. You still need to include security and compliance as part of that journey. And you have to have those checks and balances in there to make sure it is part of that journey. And here's your operational roadmap, right? So when you lay out DevOps from a 2D perspective, two-dimensional point of view, here's some of the real cool things you can do and where to integrate them in as part of this journey. Some of it's going to be automated. Now, the majority of it will be automated. There's still, in reality, there's still going to be some manual processes that are involved in this. However, automation as a general rule, manual as an exception, right? In the manual, remember this, the manual will be determined by what that risk assessment guideline provides. Not everything needs to go through a code review. Not everything needs to go through a security architecture and design. Not everything needs to be pen tested. Not everything needs to have a formal approval for release. Maybe you can have an automated approval. So again, it's using this as a model to drive the behavior and the actions as part of your journey, with the overlay of the governance on top of it. That's going to make the determination on which parts of this I'm going to touch, which parts of it I'm going to automate, and which parts do I need to continue to maintain as manual. And with that, I want to thank you for the time. Hopefully this has been a very insightful discussion. Hopefully it's generated some thoughts and new ways of thinking in terms of applying this. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'll try to respond. Thank you.